This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with three faculty members from the Department of Africana Studies at Buffalo State University. Naila Ansari is a dancer and professor in the Department of Theater. John Torrey is a theorist and professor in the philosophy department. Marcus Watson is an ethnographer and anthropologist and a professor in the individualized study program. All are core members in the Department of Africana Studies at Buffalo State, where Watson also serves as chairperson. In this conversation, we explore the relation of Black study to social and racial justice, scholarship-community relations, and the future of work in Black studies from a community and social transformation perspective. Marcus, Naila, John, it's great to see you all and have a chance to talk today.
Great to see you. Thank you
for having us. Pleasure to be here.
So we'll get into some of the specifics about thinking about the field of Black studies, obviously talk about what's going on, the kind of stuff that's going on, kind of questions you all face and have, I'm sure, talked through and thought through and are ongoing thinking and talking through with founding and expanding an Africana Studies program. But I wanted to start maybe before we get to those kinds of questions, start with an invitation for you all to really just sort of narrate your intellectual journey a little bit. You know, what questions in the study of Black life, drew you to your reading and thinking and writing, to all your teaching and professorial work. And we'll talk about how it relates to the field of Black studies, but I think it's always interesting to just hear the trajectory of people that get them to a place of investing in this particular field and the way it does the work of the study of Black life. And maybe start with you, Marcus.
Sure, thank you. For me, I think the journey starts with my upbringing. My name is Marcus Du Bois Watson, so I'm named for Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois.
Well, that's setting a standard with the names already. I love that.
I'm telling you. And so, but that gives you a sense of the kind of consciousness context that I grew up in, celebrating Kwanzaa in Buffalo, where I was born and raised growing up. Now, having been named that, I didn't establish a meaningful connections to those names until I developed, a little bit later on. But as I'm growing, I go to college, I go to Rockport for undergrad. And by that moment, consciousness is on. I'm concerned with questions of Black freedom. What does that mean? I know it's something I want. What does it mean? I've never heard of Africana studies or Black studies at Rockport. So what I did was I double majored in history and political science because I was thinking I can find something in those two fields that would have something to do with Black folks and freedom. So I double majored there, ended up going to the Peace Corps in South Africa after I graduated, fell in love with culture, Africa, and so forth. So when I go to graduate school, again, I still hadn't heard of Africana studies. Maybe that's me. But I think, there's a phenomenon of this not being a very well-known or advertised discipline. So for me, I'm thinking Africa, culture, anthropology. So I applied to anthropology programs thinking that's where I'm going to pursue these questions of freedom and culture with Africa and Black folk. I get my PhD in anthropology. But as I'm going through that process, I'm at Cornell University. So, they got a big time Africana Studies program over there. Dr. Turner, started that over there. And so I'm taking those courses. I'm loving it. I'm saying, this is what I want right here. It's reminding me of the books that were on my father's bookshelf. He has a PhD in political science. He got his PhD in 1980. He had to read his own Black curriculum as he's going through graduate school because they're not teaching Fanon and Césaire and so forth. He has to read all that. So I'm reading those books kind of as I'm going through college. And now I'm getting it again through the Africana Studies program. I go to my anthropology committee and I tell them, I want to bring in African worldview and Afrocentric and some of these things. They told me basically no.
Mm-hmm.
You know, call it a kind of academic racial prejudice, something. You know, and so I said, okay, I had a choice to make. I went on to do my PhD research, ethnography in South Africa. But the way I brought Africana studies into it was I structured my research so that the Africans who participated in my research would be the ones who would interpret through their own cultural meanings the incoming European development workers who were coming into their villages to so-called help the Africans. But see, I positioned it so that the African, what do you think of them coming in? You know, and so it's a deep dive into their cultural category, their meanings, and so forth. So that's the way I brought Africana studies right into anthropology. And ever since then, I think it's just been a journey home.
Yeah.
You know, it's been a journey home. You know, how can I make it back to Africana studies for real? And, you know, I've managed to luck out and do that here at Buffalo State University.
I love that journey home to name and bookshelf too. That's a great circle there. Naila, how about you?
Yeah, so Marcus and I have a similar story in the sense of our upbringing. So I grew up in a very community-centered Black American Muslim household, and we always had a joke that my dad converted to Islam in college. He was taking a world religions class, and my cousin always jokes that he's the only Black man she knows didn't go to jail and converted to Islam. And so we had, you know, we built a family really from an interfaith perspective. And so just taking on that journey of understanding Black life, not only from an American Christian background, but also from American Muslim background as well. So that's really been my upbringing in spaces of service. My mom works in healthcare, and my father's an imam, but he also just recently retired from Buffalo State as a men's basketball coach. So I had this crazy kind of ecosystem of Black life that really looks at the complexity of Black life, and grew up in, I would say, very much an academic family. I'm a fourth generation academic on my dad's side of educators. So I had an aunt that was a college president, had aunts and uncles and things that were professors. And so that wasn't really the norm in education when you looked at Black life in America. So I definitely wanted to be not that. And so I'm like, I'm going to go into dance. And so growing up, my family's like, what? Like, you don't want to go to Brown? You don't want to go to like these other places? Like what, like, you know, what are you doing? But come to find out, I was actually pretty good at it. I went to Point Park University Conservatory of the Arts. It's one of the top conservatories in the country. And I would say that was one of the places that built me up, but it also made me question more about myself. I grew up doing a lot of West African dance. My mother was a West African dancer as well. So when I went into a conservatory space that was very European in nature, it kind of threw me off a little bit. I was like, well, what is this modern thing? And like when I grew up doing jazz, it was very much from a Black perspective. So that was one of the first kind of spaces that I had to figure out how to navigate my Blackness in terms of the arts and what does that mean and what's value. And so I go on, have a career and dance with different folks, and was able to have, you know, now it's like Camille Brown and Robert Battle and these amazing names. So I was blessed in that way. And I got married and got divorced. In between that time, Carlos Jones, who was our dean here at Buffalo State University, was like, hey, would you ever want to be in academia? And I was like, no. I grew up in this. Like, no, I don't want to do that. He was like, no, I think you would be great. We really need someone that's in practice, but you would need to go back to school. And I was like, I don't want to go back to school for dance. I feel like I'm going to go back to school. Let me go back to school for something else. But he talked me into the University of Buffalo. I had just started their MFA program, and I got into it. And when I was there, I definitely was quickly faced with the scholarship of dance. That is still a very early field. And it's a very white and Eurocentric in the sense of what's written about dance, and Black performance studies is still fairly new. And so I had a lot of questions about myself. while I was in graduate school and reading all these theories. And I'm like, okay, well, how do we merge the practice and scholarship? Because I'm getting the scholarship part of it, but the practice part isn't really happening. So I had a pretty difficult time there, but I had an amazing professor named Torrey Pollard, who's now at VCU. And, I was in my kind of like Black radical phase of like hating white people at the time, because you just are in these institutions by yourself. And you're just like, I can't see myself in this curriculum. I can't see myself in this practice. I can't see myself in the scholarship. I'm trying to, but I just don't really want to be here. And you're like, every day is like, am I going to quit this program? And so he was like, well, instead of thinking about Black life in that perspective, what else can you think about? And the word joy just popped in my head. And from there, I started my journey of discovering like, what is Black joy? What is specifically Black women joy? And what does that look like from an interfaith perspective? And how can we archive it? Particularly through performance, because it's ephemeral. So it's there and then it's gone. So we don't know how to really capture that. But so much of the essence of that is through Black women. And I was blessed through my journey to work with Dr. Ama E. Gartz and Tagu Kuten, who was an amazing guide and still is mentor for me. And she taught me how to archive. And my first graduate assistant job was to go through the archives of Mary Talbert and the Phyllis Wheatley Club, and looking at the Black performance groups in 1901, the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. And from there, I fell in love with archives, and I just developed the project into what it is now. So it's going on its 5th year of different interviews around the country. And I'm a fellow now with Interfaith America, building the spaces of Black women prevailing through the arts as a way of understanding our joy.
Yeah, I love that. The ephemeral and the archive coming together. That's super interesting. Yeah. John, I know you and I share a doctoral institution, Memphis. Curious to hear you talk about this intellectual journey. What's brought you to this field?
Well, much like both Marcus and Naila, I'm a child of educators. Both my parents been in either grade school through college, teaching in some way, shape, or form, and so education was always kind of a key aspect of what was important for Black people. So it wasn't like just a useful thing for people, because it certainly is, but there's a specific kind of use and value for Black people because of the conditions that we're facing, that we've been living in, and that, again, my parents were coming through. So that background gave me access to dear old Morehouse College, and I majored in philosophy and Spanish. And Dr. Barry Hallen was one of my mentors there and told me I might be interested in doing some graduate work. Told me I might like the University of Memphis. There was a guy there named Bill Lawson I might be fans of. Turns out, yeah, Dr. Lawson was pretty cool. So a lot of my training ended up being in African American philosophy with a slant on social and political philosophy. And it was during graduate school I really started focusing on concepts of justice and injustice, and then from there kind of needled down deeper into thinking about reparations for Black Americans and what are the limits, the hiccups, the moral and the political issues connected with why reparations hasn't happened for Black people in this country, and what would need to change, perhaps more importantly, in order to get that going. So my research kind of focused on recognition, and more broadly, recognizing kind of the conditions and the experiences of Black people in this country at institutional levels and what that might take. And I ended up doubling back down. It's going to take us really, really investing in education and how we really communicate and talk about Black histories, Black stories, Black experiences, and Black lives and ways that are concrete, real, tangible, and don't obfuscate and whitewash and ignore the messy, nasty, and often unjust realities of Black life in this country and across the globe. That was kind of like the narrow focus I had going into Buff State. And then one of the things that's kind of come into my work now over the last few years, I found I've had a lot more focus on what does community look like as part of trying to rectify these injustices. So, there's a community of people who have been harmed. That community needs to be, made whole in some regard. I mean, Rodney Roberts, what is it? It's setting the unjust situation right? Like that's how he describes rectificatory justice. So if that's what we're going to do, we need to have an understanding of what that requires, and also an understanding of what we as a community require of each other, as well as from those who have harmed us. And so more of my focus has gotten deeper into the elements of community and putting that into practice. So I work with the New York State Commission on African American History. This is a way of trying to actually put into place making Black history part of community across all of the Empire State. On the Buffalo Board of Ethics, right? How do we make sure that we are holding our community officials accountable? Because that's part of what justice looks like. And if we're not doing that well, then we're allowing injustice to permeate and to continue. And we've done work. I could think of a conference Naila and I hosted last spring, right? Remind me the
Pursuit
name of
of
it.
Truth.
It was. Thank you. Was Pursuit of Truth following a year after the 514 massacre up here, the Tops massacre. We were able to do a conference that included a couple of survivors, but was also able to highlight both the academic and the practical nature of how racism can manifest this kind of horrific manner, what we have a responsibility to do as a community to try to work on that, and then more importantly, what we can do to try to prevent that from going forward. So I think, most of my work at this stage is, I want to make a better world. I want to see a better world. I want people to be able to live in a more just world. And I might have specific concerns, but most all of it is about how can we have what does a better community look like? And what does that look like specifically from the eyes of younger Black people? And that's one of the really cool things I think about being at Buff State is we're a majority minority serving institution. When I'm teaching my Africana classes, it's mostly Black students who are very, enthusiastic about trying to figure out more of the historical context in which their experiences in which they can make sense of their experiences and how they can keep this kind of set of experiences from continuing on in the future, at least ones that they find to be harmful, unjust, or wrong. So, that I would take to be the current intellectual journey we've got going.
And it leads perfectly into my second question for you all, which is, thinking specifically about the field of Black studies. I mean, one of the, I don't know if you want to call it a debate or just conversation around the meaning of the field, it's 50 something years old at this point, is, in some ways about its founding. I think in, to what extent we're beholden to origins of anything is an open question. But the origins of Black studies is so fascinating because it combines two elements, right? One is student protests, right? And so deeply political, like we're here, we need to be recognized, we need a place, we're going to force belonging, right? And the founding of Black studies is a key expression of this political demand for belonging, this political demand for community, to pick up, on your theme, John. And it was also driven by people concerned with the lack of representation, I don't even want to say underrepresentation, of the Black intellectual tradition in the expressive arts, in literature, poetry, historical study, and so forth. And so this sort of gave birth to two different visions of the core, I don't know if you want to call it like ethical commitment of the field or orientation of the field, like one to a politics of Black liberation and community and Black people more broadly, whether that's in the United States or in the Atlantic and outside the Atlantic world, but also to representing the intellectual tradition, to establishing it, to growing it, to getting involved in everything from archives to just existing literary figures and elevating them to this status in the academy of an intellectual tradition. And so that relationship between the sort of political demands of Black studies and the intellectual demands of Black studies, for me, is this really interesting double origin of the field. And so I did want to also ask you all how you think about and how you imagine the field of Black studies, sort of starting with this question of a dual origin. And maybe, Naila, start with you.
So it's interesting because I feel like I'm always kind of the outsider in Black studies because the arts it's not that it's not included, but it's always kind of the outside kind of looking in. It's always adjacent of like, oh yeah, let's just bring this African dance and drum class. Or when we want some type of like idea of like spirituality or these concepts of the ritual will bring in some of the arts, or we might occasionally bring in the Black arts movement, and we can occasionally talk about the Harlem Renaissance, but if there's still going to be more of a focus on the writing and the English and the poetry components of it. And so one thing that I think we've done well here at Buffalo State University, and I have to give kudos to Marcus, is that he's been able to bring in the foundations of Black studies and that space of protest, while also having community, while also understanding intellectuality. But that intellectuality encompasses all, that it is multidisciplinary, that it is interdisciplinary, and that we can't live in a space in the sense of like basically colonizing ourselves on what Black intellectuality is, and allowing our students to be a part of that process. You know, we are very open with our students. We know we had protests on campus, and we had a whole group chat of like, all right, these are the rules of the school. This is how we're going to focus, but these are also the rights that you have, and please do not reach out, and so we don't have bail money, right? So so we have those relationships, and I think that's what makes us different here. And I think in terms of looking at other Africana Studies programs across the country, we tend to miss that community part of the department, of what we also owe the community, because we don't, especially here in Buffalo, we don't have a lot of folks in the community that are accessible or even have the access to higher education. Even though we're a state school and we have more access than the average school than a lot of private or elite institutions, we don't have it in Buffalo right now to not provide the community with education. And I think that we've done that really well. And I really think it's a yes, and is that you can encompass the origins of Black studies while also still fulfilling that idea of intellectuality, and not have to necessarily live in this kind of binary of it.
John, how about you, since you had mentioned this question of community was so important in your own research?
So, the moment you asked this, I thought of, I had to pull it up, of William R. Jones, The Legitimacy and Necessity of Black Philosophy. And, that the history here is that we're supposed to be trying to unfurl the unnecessary assumptions about Black life and provide a runway for Black thought to legitimately take off. And by legitimately, I don't mean, be seen, but have the resources to be able to participate meaningfully inside the realms where academic work is seen as valued, right? Like it's take off to fly alongside the other planes, not because it's not supposed to be seen. And to that end, when I think about the first thing I tell my students, and it's usually in day one, I'll let them know that, when you're in a Black studies, like what's Africana studies for us, you're in something that's inherently revolutionary and necessary. It was 30 years ago on Family Matters, they did the episode with Laura trying to get the Black Studies class inside of the high school. And she gets, racial slurs spray painted on her locker, and, she's told go back to Africa. The necessity has been in trying to make sure that you participate in a meaningful way to develop Black thought across philosophy, sociology, anthropology, the arts, literature. We want to make sure that, at least for me, I'm not beholden to an unnecessary I'm not beholden to a sense of origin. I'm beholden to a sense of better future. Mm-hmm. That's why I think when I want, like, what's the goal? What's the purpose? We're trying to create leaders in the world who will go try to make this world a better place for people who look like them, people who trust them, and people who want to see them be in a stronger, more secure space. To me, that seems to be both the origin and the necessity of Black studies. It's to try to uplift Black life, both materially and intellectually. And so, again, to echo Naila here, Marcus has done a really good job, I think, of setting a cultural tone. And it's one that we've been able to kind of like fall under in a way of, it's important to develop a community of professors who want to create change agents as their students, who are informed by a real history of Black life across the globe, right? Like not just the imperialist business that we had to deal with here in America, but again across the continent of Africa, across Europe. We try to make sure that we're being as well-rounded and as wide-ranging as we can be, so that we can keep up with kind of how'd you describe it? The ethical, the mandate. At least from where I'm sitting, that mandate is you're supposed to come out of this wanting to help make things better for Black people, and find your space and do that job.
Marcus.
Yeah, all profound, and I agree with my colleagues. And to the extent that each of them kind of mentioned me as doing something here, if I'm gonna get credit for anything, it's I call on them, to say, hey, can you help me with this? Help me with that. So I know my genius resources, and I, if you want to give me credit, I'll take credit for that one. But I think it's important to kind of understand origins. And I like what John said a lot. I'm moved by that, actually. You and I need to talk. But in terms of thinking about it as a futuristic thing, I think we need to turn that way. But I do have some, understanding of origins. And for example, Dr. Nathan Hare, right, who becomes the director of the first Department of Black Studies at a PWI, anyway, right? He has said, quote, Black studies. First of all, he distinguishes between Black studies and what he called Negro studies. And in some way, it aligns with what you were talking about in terms of Black studies as liberation and Black studies kind of just as an intellectual project. And I agree with Naila that I think that's a false binary. Okay, but he says, Black studies, quote, is a torch with which to burn down a decadent world of corruption and oppression so that the green grass of freedom and justice can begin to grow. Then he defines Negro studies. This is in a 1970 publication. Negro studies is restricted to the recounting of our historical travails and the fettering out of Black contributions to a diabolical civilization. So when I read his work and understand his life as one of the originators of Black studies, he was very clear that Black studies comes from the Black Power movement, right? And that it doesn't come from the civil rights movement. In the civil rights movement, associated with Dr. King, that's when we're still proudly calling ourselves Negro. And our statement to the world is, white folks, we are your equals. Black Power movement comes along, and the statement, according to my understanding of it, is, who are you to be equal to anyway? In other words, it was an opening up and allowing oneself to imagine outside of the confines of a Eurocentric education, right? So that's why when we hear buzzwords like multidisciplinary, that's what my understanding, that's what Black Studies was doing from the beginning. It was already trying to break out of those kinds of narrow ways of thinking. It was already trying to, as John said, trying to say, what is our relationship to the community? Are we relevant to the community? And as you said, John Dravinsky, as you were framing this, yes, it's student protests that lead to it, but those students came from where? They were out in the communities, right, pulling off the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. Then they come to campus, right, and have a sense of what needs to be done there. So trying to break down those barriers between the academy and the community. And yes, my understanding is Africana Studies is supposed to be about change. It's supposed to be relevant. It's supposed to be about liberation. And intelligence is not, it's not distinct, from a focus on liberation. It's liberatory intelligence that heals, right? You can be intelligent, but if your intelligence is confined to just talking about stuff in a classroom, or it's caught up, trapped in a journal or a book, and it's not leading to true transformational change, then just call yourself by one of those traditional disciplinary names. But Africana Study was meant to say intelligence has to be about healing. And that can be, understood in a variety of ways. Restoration of one's history, trying to empower one's self-esteem, right? It can be a variety of things. And so to me, that's what Africana Studies is. And I think that's what we're trying to do here at Buffalo State University.
I'd be remiss if I didn't say that our own current version of the Africana Studies program was because of student protest. If memory serves, I was students with the NAACP at Buffalo State University did not like the lack of representation of enough Black professors, and they wanted to have more Black professors come to really reinvigorate the Africana Studies program. And that's, in fact, one of the reasons why the three of us are even able to be here. So, that history of protest galvanizing the institutions to try to actually recognize the value of Black studies inside of its hierarchy. We're still living testament to that right now.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny to me how I think often in these discussions about the origins of Black studies, I'm thinking of I forget the dispatches from something dispatches is in the title, but the collection of essays that Manning Marable and Henry Louis Gates put together, their debate is really in some ways talks about the origins of Black studies as if protest was a thing of the past. I'm really glad you said that because students are still protesting to get to change things. I mean, we're here talking about Black studies or Africana studies, but we could be talking about Asian American studies or Latinx studies or ethnic studies. And, that's still really alive, and it's still much more effective than all of us emailing the dean. I mean, I love the idea that the dean reads my emails. Like, shit, John said we need an endowed chair in Black studies. That scared me. Let's get it. But the students being willing to deal with the consequences of their protest for the sake of something, I think really underscores what all of you are saying about they want the intellectual life of things that have to do with Black people. But they also understand that this is political and transformative enough that they're willing to risk a lot. Because it is a big risk. If you are in college and you engage in these kind of level of protests, it's a scary thing and takes courage. But more than courage and facing fear, I think it really asks you, it really poses a question to me, at least, when I see this happen of like, well, they're really pointing out that the intellectual life and the community life have an energy between them that we then have to cultivate and maintain. Marcus, you're going to say something.
Yeah, if I could just follow up. I think, following what you're saying, I think it's important to understand that within the first year of the establishment of Black studies at San Francisco State College, and I think we know this history, the Ford Foundation comes in, right, under the leadership of McGeorge Bundy. And they are giving millions of dollars to establish Black studies departments all over the country, but it's with conditions. So, and there's a history on this, and there are books written on it, but they basically say, we will fund the development of a Black studies department so long as you get rid of the liberation idea and the community idea. Right. And there are people within the board quoted as saying that, right? So in other words, they if it's coming truly out of the Black Power movement, that kind of Black studies program will not be funded. It's still going to be called Black studies, but now anachronistically, they're making it attach back to something earlier, that was devoid of those kinds of ingredients, And so I think from very early on that happened to the point that I'm not sure if we know what it was originally supposed to be. If we forget that missing year of sabotage, of Black studies.
No, this important historical context. And this is where, part of why, just to go back to the origin story of this particular podcast series, I mean, it's exactly thinking about these origin moments and how fraught and complicated and varied they are is really part of what this podcast series, what Ashley and I have been interested in and how that resonates today. So let me pick up on what you were saying earlier, Marcus, just the term used, multidisciplinary, and that this is something that Black Studies has been doing since the beginning. And think about that disciplinary and multidisciplinary, because all of you are trained in a discipline. And I do think this is a question from my department constantly, when will we start hiring Black Studies PhDs? When will, when will Black studies be represented by PhDs from those programs? Because, they sometimes get hired in them, sometimes get hired in disciplines, but also Black studies departments are comprised of all kinds of different disciplines. And so for me, it's a really interesting question. And I think about this a lot in terms of my own work as well. And so I wanted to ask you all, how has that, and I'm asking this in two registers. One, how has being trained in a discipline and perhaps still working at the university in some ways in a discipline, but also working, teaching, and researching in an area of studies, working in Black studies, how has that changed your teaching and research? Being trained in a discipline, but teaching in a multidiscipline, but also teaching in a multidiscipline and then also teaching in a discipline. So that movement back and forth. So both in terms of your own research and teaching now, but then in terms of the scope of the field, how do you think about that relationship between disciplinary training and working in Black studies has also opened up contributions to the field of Black studies in really important ways? Maybe start with you, Marcus, since you had mentioned this question of the multidisciplinary.
Sure. There's that joke that says PhD could stand for piled higher and deeper, depending on what you do,
thoughts, ideas, insight,
yeah.
or bullshit.
So, but I think that's what's at stake. I think that's what's at stake in being trained in a discipline, and not just going through the program, but truly internalizing, what is essentially most likely a Eurocentric, kind of education and perspective within a traditional discipline. My understanding is basically that most of what we call departments and intellectual fields are traceable to European Enlightenment philosophy, and they kind of come out of that. So, for me, my understanding again of what multidisciplinary was supposed to mean, it wasn't supposed to mean that we go into the traditional disciplines and use their Eurocentric theories, paradigms, and so forth to study Black people, which is essentially a European study of Black folks. A multidisciplinarity to me was supposed to be in the aid of the subject matter of Black liberation, right? So that any one scholar might delve into some history and some dance and some philosophy and so whatever it takes to produce knowledge, right, that helps us better understand, Black situations, Black histories, so that we can become actionable about Black liberation, which, there's a premise that would lead to human liberation, right? That would lead to, it would help everybody syllogistically. And so for me personally, I go through the anthropology PhD program, but it doesn't capture the whole of me at all. I'm Black in there. I know that I am. I want to be. It's reinforced in a variety of ways. I'm thinking about the things they're teaching me, from an African-centered point of view, based on how I grew up, based on the side curricular readings that I did, the books that were on my father's show. And so it was never really a total capture. I think I was always Black studies, right? I ended up, I think I did pretty good at using anthropology, right, for the sake of Black liberation or producing knowledge for Black liberation. And so when I'm researching and teaching, I might use some anthropology tools here, but that is not the motivation or spirit of it. It is an Africana Studies spirit with which I approach research and how I teach.
Naila, I was thinking around this question. I was thinking in particular about when you were describing your intellectual journey and that movement from, an MFA in dance, but also getting interested in archives and histories and thinking about dance. This strikes me as a really interesting question for a performance person, right? Because you have that interest in archives, but also, you can't just show up to a dance, right?
Right.
Yeah, to dance, you have to. There's physical training, right, about the body, but obviously those two are infusing each other. So I'm curious what all you think, but you had sort of staged this question in some ways when you described your own intellectual journey.
Oh, for sure. And it's dance is interesting because we don't necessarily have the same kind of canon, even especially in like scholarship. So if you're working in English, you have this canon, everybody should know these books. Dance is very broad in the sense of, like, for me, I was able to go in almost backwards. Like, everyone thinks that you're supposed to learn ballet. That's the main form, and that's what's going to get you to wherever. And in some ways, there's a yes and to that. Like, I grew up with West African first and tap and jazz. And so I was always around Blackness, which just elevated to me ballet. When it came to me, it was like more of like, okay, this is the thing that we all need to do because this has become the common language, but that's not who I am. So in dance practice, I would say there's this idea of the foundation, but the foundation is always meant to be changed, deconstructed, and created in different ways so that you really can develop your own stories. So there's always been a research component when you're an artist that doesn't necessarily transfer the opposite way. If you're a scholar, you don't necessarily, like, I can have scholarship and read all day about dance and theorize all day. That doesn't mean I have a practice, which actually has been very problematic in academia. And there's a lot of students, particularly undergraduate students, that are trying to figure out, all right, I have this person who does this scholarship that's telling me about dance and how I'm supposed to theorize about dance, but they've never necessarily been a practitioner. So you're really starting to see more of the practice scholar coming out. Dr. Amma always calls them scholar artists or scholar artists. And that's because that's who we always are. Artists, we always have to investigate before we have a story that we're getting ready to be told. You can't call yourself an artist and not be a researcher. And so for me, it was more so understanding the foundations of archiving and quite literally like the logistics. Like, you go in and you have to sign in and go in, like, don't touch this. For me, it was more of learning how to be in a space as opposed to understanding like the research of what I was doing, because I had always been archiving, just didn't know that's what the practice was. Academically.
Yeah, it's funny you say that about the scholar without the practice. I just have to say, I doubt the student's going to listen to this, but I had a section where I showed some dance and talked about it in relation to to Hurston's Characteristics of Negro Expression essay, and the student did say, "So can you dance?" And there was this. I was like, I'm going to answer this, but if you think the answer is going to lead to anything like a performance, you're wrong.
Right. And they're really not the same, right?
So you triggered me a little bit there. I was like, oh, yeah, no.
And the thing, and I think I'll be more explicit in it, is that there's a lot of people that are getting academic jobs specifically in arts departments without the practice, right? And so when we talk about academia and what they value, when we talk about the intellectuality, what becomes the PhD becomes a more of a intellectual, like, for me, it's like the graduate degree was more so just so that I could work in an institution, not because I needed it. Because quite frankly, I had the information to it. I just maybe learn more about the logistics of academia and how it functions. And so that, I think that's more of like less about like showing things. I think it's important to show the arts, and particularly in Black Studies courses, but it's more so in like, who are we hiring in these institutions? Because the practice of the arts is just as vital in the experiential part of it when you're teaching it, just as much as the scholarship is, but the two don't, one can go into the other can't go into the practice.
John, how about you?
So the being able to work with other disciplines inside Black Studies, when outside of Africana Studies, one thing I can shout out about Buff State's version of this is we all get to play to our strengths. So I'm teaching an African American philosophy class and an Africana philosophy class that get to feature the stuff I love doing, which is working inside of an already relatively narrow field, which is horrible to say as is, but such is the predicament. So I get to feature a number of living, and not just dead, like Black philosophers active in the field, both locally and globally. in a way that lets students know that they're, what you're seeing isn't peculiar, unique, or weird for you. You can pick this up, you can do this work, you can apply this work, and you can, if you want to take this on and try to take this kind of work on, whether academically or communitarily, you can take this on and know that it's done by people like you. And so, I really appreciate getting to play to the strengths inside of a multidisciplinary unit. At least in terms of my teaching, both being able to both play into my strengths and invite other professors in from the unit has been super helpful because, as I'm sure you know, John, philosophers attack the world in a very unique way, but we don't do it the only way. So it's good for us to be able to expose our students. That last thing is hard to
admit, but you're absolutely right. I guess it's not the only way.
We're first for a reason. But other people have other ways, right? So getting to have Marcus come in, getting to have Naila come in, getting to have Dr. Douglas Hostin come in, getting to have Amable, oh Lord, I don't want to butcher his last name, but the good Dr. Amable from the English department. Right? We have a whole lot of, we have a cavalcade of quality people from across different disciplines who all have the same general background about the importance of providing different context for our students to be able to engage with regards to Black life. And so I take that to be, a unique benefit from the interdisciplinary approach. And, at least as a Black philosopher, doing the job for our research, it's often, we often have to pull from other disciplines as a nature trying to create the kinds of arguments that we're crafting. We're going to pull from anthro, we're going to pull from sociology, we're going to pull from the arts, we're going to pull from literature, we're going to pull from history, in order to help make whatever kind of contextualized case we need to have, in part because we don't have, say, 100 years of history to pull from in the same sort of way canonically that, if you're an Aristotle scholar, you've got thousands of years to pull from. We don't quite have that kind of history. And so the inherent interdisciplinarity of being a Black philosopher, particularly one engaged in, say, social political work and ethic work, it fits right in with the groove that we've got going here at Buff State. And I think with the interdisciplinary unit like we got.
Yeah, the engaging with different fields, just anecdotally, I remember, it was 20 years ago or so, when I had really committed to Black studies, I said to my wife one time, literature really has a lot going on, and she's an English professor. So it's the first marriage test.
Yes.
There's real thinking going on in these novels. And a couple weeks later, when she was back to talking to me, we flesh that out a little bit. But the way it really does both invite and in some ways force us to think about other disciplines. I've really loved that. Having been fully committed to Black studies for around 20 years, it's been amazing. I like reading, and there's always so much more to read once you step out of your particular disciplinary thing. So let me ask a really speculative question about the field, looking back, and even in the present, but really looking back in its history. What do you all think that the field of Black studies has done particularly well, and what do you think it has not done very well? Maybe start with you, Marcus.
Cool. Yeah, my answer would be pretty concise here. A colleague brother of mine, Dr. Frederick Douglass Dixon, he and I wrote an article together titled Nuanced Negro Study. It was published with C.O. Bonanna, an Africana Studies journal. And so I'm going to, kind of pick up on what we were arguing there, which is essentially that I think Africana Studies has done well at theorizing and providing a super sophisticated, interesting, intellectual kinds of studies of all matter of phenomena. And the flip side of that is, I think, what has been sacrificed largely is that my understanding of an original commitment to practice, to application, to relevance, to producing texts that the quote unquote person on the bus can read and make use of. Well, I think I'll leave it at that, but that's how I see the last several decades of Black studies.
Yeah, I agree with Marcus on that. And for me, I don't think we've done a great job at understanding the scholar, especially when we talk about oral traditions. And I think of someone like Mama Gee here, who's been known in the community, who like I would learn more from her as the history of Black dance and West African traditions come into the US, more from her than I would ever learn from any scholar. And she doesn't have a PhD, right? She doesn't have an MFA. She doesn't have these higher ed degrees. And so I think for us, how do we, I don't know that we do that well of like living in the ivory tower. And I know there's been a lot of, books and writing that. It's like you join the ivory tower, then but how do you go back to the community that taught you how to get there in the first place? And then what does that look like when we talk about scholarship? Because we often ask these people to come to our classes. We ask these folks to come and speak to the community because they're in the community, but we don't necessarily coin them as scholars. So I don't know that we are doing that particularly well. And I think part of that is we're always trying to justify ourselves in academia, right? We're always trying to get to that point of like what we deem as a scholar, as someone that is like hyper intellectual. And so I think that's something that we can work on, because I think that we've proven it. We know we can write well. We know we can have well-read people. I don't know that we have to keep proving that to ourselves as much as that we have to prove to our elders and folks in the community that have had these traditions that we keep going to, that they are equally as scholars, if not more than we are.
Yeah, it raises this question: what is an intellectual? Right,
Mm-hmm. Right.
Have we really thought through that?
Right,
John.
Something that I think Black studies have done well is really made itself known and have like a legitimate presence. There's something to be said for, like 50 years of hip hop, 50 years of Black studies. That means there's a time beforehand when this thing did not exist. There was no concept, there was no relevance, there was no way to describe it, there was no institutionalization of it. So to have matured across 50 years such that, podcasts like this can happen, the departments like we all work in can exist, a thirst for this kind of information can be met at higher education institutions. That seems to suggest, Black studies has been doing a pretty good job of gaining traction in ways that I can imagine a number of other, like affinity group based disciplines have not been able to get that same kind of traction or growth across a 50-year period, particularly the last 50 years. One can imagine if we started this off in say 1915 as opposed to 1970, what kind of work could have been getting done, what kind of growth those departments would have had. What does that look like at an HBCU that has this kind of space? But to that end, what we haven't done well, there's a lack of these kinds of present. These departments don't exist in great preponderance like they should at many historically Black colleges and universities. And part of that's because, they're doing, I think, Black studies as part of the general curriculum, but there seems to be perhaps a missing opportunity there to really kind of reinforce the specific value of Black studies inside of Black institutions. Connected with that, I'm very concerned about potential fracturing inside of the Black studies community because of updated concerns and oppression Olympics and, competitions about between a number of groups inside the Black community trying to make sure to be seen, recognized, have their issues and values met, and heard and be relevant and be recognized. And though, and all of those claims for recognition, I think are very real. I do get nervous that right now we're not doing a good job of navigating, these claims because we're calling them competing claims when, we're all basically in a very rough end of a very bad ship that's kind of going down, right? Like, so to that end, it strikes me that the deeper we get into the oppression Olympics kind of scenario, the more I think we're going to end up losing a lot of important gains that we've had inside of Black studies, like as developing both a community, an intellectual and an interpersonal community, but also what that does to the scholarship that's being developed both now and in the future.
Marcus?
Yeah, I have an original thought, but based on what John said, I want to echo what my colleagues said a few times. That I think here at Buffalo State Africana Studies, you do a good job of recognizing a general interest that we share, a general appreciation for the value of Africana studies, but we don't over determine each other. We are so welcoming of the different perspectives, the disciplines, the backgrounds we come from, and it just makes it work. And I think our students see that, and they have ways of communicating that to us. I like John because they say doctor this and that, but I like John because of this, and Naila, but we're just allowed to be ourselves, even as we are attacking this thing from a variety of angles. But I wanted to say something again that my colleague brother, Dr. Frederick Douglass Dix, I want to make sure he gets credit for this, but I've heard him speak and ask us to, in Africana study, to at least contemplate what the title doctor means from a Black studies perspective. And what he would say is that, a doctor in the medical field means something to do with healing. Mm-hmm. And I think that applies, from certain perspectives of Black studies history, that it's supposed to be about healing, and so that folks who Naila's talking about from the community, who actually know more in a lot of ways than what we do, when they come and visit my classes, if they might have a master's degree, they might not have no degree, but my students know I'm saying doctor, and they know the definition I'm using. This is a healer, right? And I try to share how this person is using their knowledge and their life to heal in a variety of ways, right, out in the community. And the flip side of that, the sensitive side of that, there might be people who have that designation, but the work they do and what they're about, it might not be about healing. And so, but they have that title, doctor. Anyway, but something to think about,
Yeah, I love that. I'm glad you said that. I had never actually contemplated the resonance of that word, doctor, and healing. That's fantastic. Mm-hmm. Let me see if I can spread that through my department. Yeah. Retreat in a month. I like that. I love that. Thank you. Let me ask another speculative question that's really about the destiny. I mean, I don't think we're anywhere near this place, as identity-based inquiry is under such scrutiny, and I think always on the verge of being closed down. But if we think about the destiny of Black studies, it strikes me that there are two ways of thinking about it, and I'll try to articulate it briefly here. One is, look, the founding of Black studies and the need for Black studies today comes from the fact that if you look at a history department, you look at an English department, you look at a theater department, you look at any department, disciplinary department, there's this, if there is any, there's a severe underrepresentation of Black traditions in the Black Atlantic world. And so we need Black studies at its origins and today because that inquiry into Black life doesn't exist in these departments. And there are a couple of ways to think about that. One is that the ultimate aim or destiny of Black studies is to no longer be Black studies, to so transform disciplines that Black life becomes part of every discipline. And then Black studies is no longer needed, just sort of its work is done. The other side of that, other sort of vision of the destiny of the field for me is that Black studies comes together out of this gap in inquiry. But in that coming together has developed senses of methodologies that actually just aren't produced in disciplines. And so that Black studies becomes less an area study that is multidisciplinary, and its destiny is actually to be a discipline, and maybe is already at that place or near that place now. And so thinking about the destiny of Black studies, either to eventually not be needed, to eventually eliminate itself, because it is so transformed its disciplines, or that it is actually the development of methodologies that become disciplinary-ish, right, or disciplinary enough to never go away, to actually be a field of inquiry that has a future as long as humans have on the planet. So I'm curious how you all think about that destiny. I know it's a speculative question, but why not, John?
I think that could be a both and. So the development of those methodologies into the units and the departments that we're going to have and continue to have now, that research is going to ultimately come back into those same units that, where we need more Black scholarship. Well, we'll be pulling from Black studies as opposed to, say, specifically trying to pull from Black people inside of our specific domains, right? So I think I'm not sure that it has to be like an elimination or a full department, full departmenting across all institutions. I imagine that by the addition of more departments, we're going to end up with more scholarship, which ends up bleeding back into all of those other disciplines in some regard, in part because Black studies operates with a multidisciplined modality of inquiry in such a way that some of the stuff that's going to be written will inherently be literature. So English classes can pull that, and they need to see something that's going to be able to talk about the Black experience. They won't necessarily be looking for Black authors. They'll be looking for Black studies, literature specialists. Okay, that's that's a step further down the line, but it also keeps the that connection for trying to create more diversity inside of our traditional canons. We're just going to be pulling from a different context, right? Like, so I think the development of more departments creates new context from which those original departments can now pull from, as opposed to feeling so limited in what they can or cannot find. Does that make some sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. Naila?
Yeah. So to kind of connect a little with John there, I mean, in some ways it's happening because we have deficits happening like all around the country, right? So in some cases, like, departments are merging. It is happening to some extent financially. But when we look at what's happening in terms of innovation in AI, the foundation of what's happened in academia is also happening in AI. And you're going to have something else to contribute, because we're not at the groundwork of what's happening. We're not being developed at the same time as these other institutions or as technology is being developed. So yes, to John's point, you're still always going to need that expert that comes in. And quite frankly, when you look at AI, and they hear me talk about this all the time with like innovation and building innovation. My husband works in AI. And as we talk about this, you have to have a human in the loop. But what a human in the loop, you have to have more expertise and you have to be more specific than anybody ever had to be in order to build AI, in order to build the innovation that's getting ready to happen. It doesn't work in reverse. Like, people can't be less intelligent. Like, that's not a thing if we're trying to be in positions and role in leadership. So I think Africana Studies, Black Studies has almost a leg up, in the sense of, like, we are such an expertise and a specialty that people are going to have to come to us, because what's being built is still foundationally very white, very male.
Marcus?
Yeah, I agree with my colleagues saying, to the extent they're saying it's a both and type of situation. My question might be, can the Africana Studies methodology become a standard or a go-to, at least for the traditional disciplines? To me, but Black studies, if we're going to say it's no longer needed, then to me we're saying it's no longer needed when white supremacy is no longer a thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
To put it in a kind of Harry Potter context, right? What white supremacy's Horcrux. White supremacy Horcrux. You guys know Harry Potter?
yeah.
That magical thing that keeps white supremacy going, arguably, is anti-Black racism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right? Everything else can kind of move and shift, but if Black ever moved out of its boxed in position as the ultimate not human, the ultimate negative, right? Then white supremacy loses its footing, right? Just based on the history of, enslavement of millions of African people and justifying that philosophically in every other way, right? So I think that's what we're saying. I mean, it would be to say Black studies no longer needed. We're saying hooray, that white supremacy has buckled to its knees, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
John?
To piggyback off that, first of all, I had to write that down, Marcus. That Horcrux. I'm gonna use that with my students as well. And I was thinking actually about the need because of the systematic attacks, right? So, like, the way that Marcus has described this, we can jump for joy if Black studies is not needed because of the Horcrux is gone. Well, color me infused by racial realism, I don't know that we'll ever get rid of that Horcrux. And so if that is the case, then we're going to end up needing these departments to be bulwarks against that anti-Black racism and against that white supremacy.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of, I don't have it here for the direct quote, but in a essay from mid-40s, Richard Wright talks about we'll know that that racism has ended when there is no longer a thing called Negro literature, right? And then he sort of laughed because he's Richard Wright, as you said, he's like a realist about this. He's like, which of course is never going to happen, but that would be our sign, right?
Right.
So last question, concluding question, which is, again, a speculative one. What is the question that you think the field of Black Studies needs to be asking most urgently in halfway through 2024, in 2024? What's that question you think we should all be asking if we work in the field? Naila?
Ooh, I actually think about this a lot because the older I get, the more of the generational divide in the classroom I see. And it's like,
don't get me started. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, what is the future? And I think for us, one thing that I ask myself is, how do we put ourselves out there more for the younger generation to understand the importance of why we're needed? And I don't know that we do the best job. I think when you're in a class, yes, you have access to being in an academic setting. But when we talk about the generation that are the younger generations as a whole, how are we actually connecting to folks? And I think that's the community part of Black Studies, is how are we engaging in the community in a real way that doesn't, I was listening, I want to say it's Van Jones, not that I'm necessarily the biggest fan, but he did mention like the younger generations love to deconstruct, but they don't necessarily care about the solutions. It's like we want to deconstruct all these systems, but the solutions are what we teach all the time. And so they exist, but how do we get this younger generation to listen and understand the importance? Because we are really at a watershed moment that if we don't have enough people that are with us, we can go back to some decades and generations we don't want to be in. And people are very unapologetic about it. And so that's my question, is like, how do we connect with the innovation in the world that we live in now and understand the importance of what we all teach and what we all do in the field to matter to the younger generation?
Marcus?
Yeah, I love that. If we distilled a fundamental question this generation is asking, it is, what is the point? A lot of people are sure, what is the point? What is the point of me even? What is the point of trying to do something for social justice? What they have in the back of their mind is, how many more protests? How many more deaths? How many more whatever? It still has. So, I don't know if you agree, but I've heard that kind of question resonating with this generation. What is the point? So I think one thing Black Studies scholars can ask ourselves is, how do we answer that question for them? I mean, in some sense, I think Black Studies should be the answer. What's the point? Come to Black Studies and find out. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. But
that's a great banner question on a website, by the way. Like, seriously. Sorry to interrupt you.
We're not on copyright now. We're going to copyright that over here.
Marcus said he's not good at marketing, and he coming out with the slogans.
But I also think a fundamental question that I wish Black Studies would be asking is, what about the earth? What about Mother Earth? I think sometimes, and I'm not critical, really. We're socialized in a way where it seems like the dominant motivation is to kind of prove that we can do things, right? As Dr. Nathan Hare had said earlier, how we are contributing, what he would say, to a diabolical civilization, but how we're contributing to America, how we're contributing to the culture. But I don't want us to be blind that we are fundamentally in an anti-nature, anti-earth culture, right? That seems to, not everyone, of course, but seems to not be that concerned with building up big things made out of the earth, but those things are not built in a reciprocal manner where they can return to the earth, like those mud structures of West Africa, right? That are mistakenly understood as being backward or something. No, those were built by people who had a sense of human earth reciprocity. right? What they built up from the earth is capable of being reciprocated back to her, right? And so I would want us to not lose sight when we're trying to advance here and develop here. Where do we stand? Where do our efforts take us in relation to the earth, and how are we supposed to be relating to her?
I love that. John?
Well, I won't, belabor the point here. We have a very interesting next few months coming ahead. So if we're thinking about the question that Black Studies should be asking this year and going forward, it is, how are we connecting the community with their civic responsibilities? How are we making sure that our communities feel like they are responsible, capable, and necessary parts of the civic engagements of our nation? And I don't take that to be a small question, because we need more Black people voting. We need more people of color voting. We need more people participating inside the political process, that's running as candidates, that's running as, run for your student body, for school board, running from there all the way up to your Congress. We need more people to feel engaged in that process, who have that liberatory, revolutionary spirit and want to see more for Black people. Right. I take it that we have to do more community work in order to do that. And that's, it just strikes me that if we don't think more about how we're supposed to invigorate the Black community with an ethical norm for having a civic mind, we're going to miss a lot of opportunities now and going forward, regardless of who ends up being in office come next year. As a block, as a political block, as an organizing block, we need to be trying to weaponize is the wrong word, but utilize that specific sort of power that's available, and inform the community, both young, old, and in between, that power is available for them to wield and to utilize in your best interests, and that it's not throw your hands up. Right. I think I would want to say, how can we prevent apathy inside the community? Because I don't want it to. The scariest thing in the world to me is navigating a generation of young people who think that there's nothing left for them to fight for. That is the situation that as Black Studies goes, with the kind of systematic pressures to chop away and whitewash Black history, to chop away and remove resources towards protecting identity-based groups and scholarship. We have enough avenues for people to throw their hands up and go, well, everything's already going to hell. What else can I do? As Black Studies people, we need to be invigorating those communities and asking, how can we connect them with that civic duty and that ethical sense that we should be participating so that we can have the world that we want.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I asked all these questions, but I'm glad we were able to conclude with these really fantastic stuff to think about. And I really appreciate you all making the time. I mean, it's mid-June. It's when everybody's, often wants to be doing other things, but I really appreciate you all coming to share insights on the field of Black Studies. I have to say, I think anybody listening to this is going to say there's really great stuff going on at Buffalo State. And I feel really happy and lucky to have you all share that and pass that on. And so
I know John's like leaping in, Marcus, but we are actually raising money so that we can develop an Institute of Africana Studies here at Buffalo State University, so that we can be more than a department, but also a home and a space for Black students, brown students, our students in general, to be able to understand Black studies and what that means, and also have a space for the community as well.
That is fantastic.
Yes.
I absolutely love that. Send me the link, and I will put
Nikki Giovanni,
it on the podcast.
Bringing Nikki Giovanni in for our first fundraiser. So,
Excellent.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed and blessings for us.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, thanks a lot. And again, really appreciate everybody's time. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Appreciate you having us.
Bye-bye.